Hi, it's Katya, and I want to talk today about the Saturn-Pluto, which is, if you don't know, it's a configuration where the planet Saturn and the planet Pluto, astrologically speaking, are conjunct. There are nuances to this that has to do with latitude versus longitude, so don't get too hung up on the astronomy of it, which has a longer explanation that we could do in a different context, but they are, astrologically speaking, conjunct. They're in the same sign, and they're close enough that they are forming a sort of, when two planets are conjunct, they create a sort of super planet, or those are the words of Stephen Forrest, or the way I like to think of it as they join forces and they have one kind of mission that they are working together. It's a collaboration. So to understand what's going on right now, it's a very intense thing. That's why I'm making a video about it that I hope will help us to grok what's going on in energetically in a much bigger sense, and to explain some of the very intense things that are happening in the world right now. So the exact conjunction takes place where they are actually at the same degree, I believe on January 12th, 2020. But up until then, they are close enough and they're slow enough moving planets that we are already in it. As of October 29th, today, 2019, we are very much feeling Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And it's very important if you like to understand, if you find it helpful, as I do, to understand the dynamics going on in our lives and why, then it is very helpful to understand what is doing in your chart. So to understand that, you would need to know your time of birth and calculate a birth chart, which you can do for free on astro.com. You can also contact me, and that's just katya.coach. And I do mini readings, I do full readings, and I can help you understand what's going on with Saturn Pluto in your chart, because for every person, they're going to be conjunct in a different house, and the houses represent the areas of your life. So for someone, they may be really transforming. That's what Saturn and Pluto do when they're together. They're really transforming in a very lasting way, in a very fundamental way. They may be transforming your identity, or they may be transforming your friendships, or they may be transforming the way that you express yourself, or your health, or your career, right? These are just examples, and they were not sequential. So of different houses and areas of your life that correspond to areas of your life where this can be happening. So it's great to know on a personal level what's going on there. But what I'm going to be speaking today about generally is what we can all expect a little bit from Saturn-Pluto to some extent, and how we can, in order to help us get through this personally, but also hold space for others. Because during this transit, you're going to see a lot of people, you're likely to see a lot of people going through very intense experiences, and knowing what's going on, you can actually become a space holder for them and hold a bigger vision, a bigger picture. So I'm going to read a little bit and kind of alternate reading from the notes I have and talking, because I don't want to miss anything. So Pluto is the outermost planet that I work with. I know there's been controversy. Is it a planet? Is it not? But I do work with Pluto as a planet for all intents and purposes. And its symbolism has to do with the unconscious, with power and with transformation. So if we think about Pluto as the outermost planet, the one furthest from the sun, or furthest from the center of our solar system, our personal solar system and our collective solar system, then Pluto represents that unconscious material that is very far away. If you've ever seen those photos of an iceberg and you see what's above the ocean and then you see what's below the ocean, and it's quite a bit larger underneath, right? So the idea is that about 95% of our material, and of course it's going to depend on how conscious we are and how much work we've done in that area, but still, you know, a lot of the material that actually runs us is unconscious. So we're thinking, when we think of Pluto, we're thinking of the material that's quite far underneath the surface. And at the same time, we should, we do well to remember that just because it's far away does not mean that it is not powerful. In fact, we know from our own experiences, if you think, just take a brief foray through your own life, that when those unconscious experiences or when unconscious material does come up to the surface, it can crash things and demolish things like a tidal wave, right? Maybe there's trauma. Pluto is associated with trauma. The trauma is a thing that we bury. But when it comes up, right, you're having an experience with your partner and suddenly your trauma gets triggered, and that the power of that comes in. Your prefrontal cortex is completely hijacked. You're not thinking straight. You're only acting from that unconscious material. So Pluto can act very much like this, is that it can be, completely unnoticeable. It's not active in the chart. And then suddenly it just boom, rears its head, and a lot of things can be changed. A lot of, it can affect a lot. It's very powerful. Pluto has immense creative power, and within that, it can also destroy before it creates. So because of that, right, probably because, okay, so let me back up a little bit. So Pluto can come up from the depths within to demolish all that no longer serves and to strengthen and intensify that which does serve. So probably because we are at the end of an era and a lot of things are needed to be thrown into the furnace right now, because, we need to do that in order to revision ourselves, rebirth ourselves the way that we want on planet Earth, in humanity. Because of that, I feel a lot of people understand and relate with that part of Pluto that comes in and demolishes things a lot more than we hear the other part of that sentence, which is that Pluto also strengthens and intensifies that which is serving. And I will go back to that later. So, because we associate Pluto with that demolition, that destruction, we're also associating it often with loss. Loss. So I think that with any Pluto transit, any big Pluto transit that happens, and perhaps especially in the case of Saturn conjunct Pluto, because Saturn is also such a heavyweight and an intense planet wherever it is transiting in our chart. It's not an easy place typically, unless we're a very hardworking person, because that's what Saturn rewards. So because Saturn is also a tough teacher and Pluto is, I think many people who have some sense of astrology are fearing or maybe fearing loss. If you're not fearing loss, please don't start fearing loss, because I just said that. Please watch the rest of the video so that you can understand these archetypes and dispel that. And indeed, already I have seen losses of different kinds occurring, and in some cases very intense ones, including intense health diagnoses, intense endings to relationships, to in some cases very, very long relationships, 24-year relationships. That was the longest one that I've seen, and positions, work positions, also ending. So I've seen a lot of losses, actually. And we've also obviously seen many intense dynamics rising up in the collective. I can't name all of them. We've seen loss of land through fires. We've seen, hurricanes. We've seen active discussion about nuclear weapons and who's building what, and that happening. That's very much a Saturn-Pluto thing. Power. Pluto's about power. So, and Saturn's about structures. So, and institutions and everything that has that kind of structure around it. So, I'm going to build the strongest nuclear weapon. No, I'm going to, and that's rising. And what's going on with people losing their home with the refugee crisis going on right now. So that's very much also, loss. And obviously, some of these losses in the collective sense, in the case of nuclear weaponry especially, it presents us with the possibility of loss that's greater in magnitude than we can probably even imagine. With all of this occurring personally and collectively, it can become easy to fear Pluto or view Pluto as a bad guy. But to understand Pluto, I'm going to propose for a moment that we meditate on something, on what loss is and what death is. And this is tricky because as I say this, I don't mean in any way to minimize or invalidate the grief that comes from loss. And the perspective I'm inviting us into is one that death and grief are both as essential to life as birth and celebration of birth and growth. And if we imagine for a moment what life would be, my partner, Jeremy, asked the other day, he just brought up this kind of very simple and yet very powerful question. What would life be like without death? What would it be like here if we didn't have death? And I think that's a very powerful question to ask ourselves at this time. So if we start to get into this understanding that yes, death is sacred, it has this incredible power, and begin to see it more as a transformation than as an ending of any definitive kind. Once we have really felt the power and the beauty of that of course includes within it loss and the grief and the pain associated with loss, that is such a beautiful part of the human experience, then we can begin to understand the archetype of Pluto. So a significant Pluto transit may come and demolish that which is no longer serving, that which is no longer bringing life, and that which is no longer juicy. And I use that word because it's like that really brings it into your experience. What is juicy for you right now? What is bringing you life? And that is something in a way that only when we are in contact with our deepest soul can we really be honest with ourselves. Is this job still bringing me joy? Is this relationship still bringing me life and joy? It doesn't mean that it's never hard. It means, is it still adaptive? Is it still growing you in healthy ways, in ways that may feel so intense that you feel like you're going to tear apart, but at the same time, you know that you're just feeding on it in a very healthy way and becoming someone even stronger than you ever thought possible. So Pluto will come in and, Pluto and Saturn are not, although Saturn can be associated with like structures and authority, they're not actually like school marms, they're not, they don't have an agenda that is similar, like like, or that is as limited as our authority figures here on earth. Okay, they are working for your soul. So when Pluto comes in and demolishes things, it's not demolishing things that are bad, societally speaking, or based, according to conditioning. It's demolishing those things that are actually no longer serving us on a soul level. So back to what I touched on in the very beginning of the video is that Pluto also comes in and intensifies and strengthens that which is serving. And because it's a transpersonal planet, and this is very important, it's going to come in and strengthen and intensify not just what's serving you in your life, but what is serving the whole and what is serving humanity. What about you? What in you? What is it that you're doing that's going to serve the greater, that's going to serve life here on earth? So I just wanted to give an example and tell a story as an example of this. So I just heard yesterday from a longtime acquaintance. I received news of a very difficult medical diagnosis that she received. And I actually was given permission by her to share her story in some detail here. So she is a 39-year-old woman, and she was diagnosed with the beginning stages of cognitive decline from Alzheimer's. Now, this is a woman, she's a mother, and she's a vibrant person. She's been on a spiritual path. She's educated, she's well-traveled. She is someone who's very much awake and aware and on her journey in an intentional way. So here she is getting this diagnosis, and she decided to turn this experience that she's having, which we can imagine how deeply impactful that is, and some of the emotions that might come with that. And she decided to turn it into a massive art project where she's putting together a book, and that book consists of many paintings that she's creating. So she's creating a bunch of paintings telling a story, and these paintings and the story will be turned into a book and an art show, both, that will be telling the story of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, essentially, or giving the message of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So she's developing this now. And the idea is to bring a much more sanctified approach to death into hospitals. This art exhibit will go into hospitals, it will go into hospices, it will go into spiritual centers and centers of all kinds. I would hope that it would maybe make its way into some schools, if we're open enough to something like that. But that to me is a very, very profound example of the kind of composting process that Pluto can harbinger. So we can see in this story Pluto both demolishing something, so it's a health piece and everything that is associated with that, right? For this person, there's so much branching out. It's not just health, it's all these different things, right? And then we also see it strengthening something else, which is this woman's creative and artistic drives. And it is compounding her wisdom. So Pluto is acting as this kind of pressurizing. Saturn is more the pressure planet, but Pluto and Saturn together definitely creating, the transformation that includes pressurizing her wisdom that she's developed and gleaned over many years on a spiritual path, with her creative drive, her artistic abilities, and making that into something unique and extraordinarily nourishing and very timely for the whole world. So I just think that that's an incredibly, incredibly beautiful representation of Pluto Saturn. So Maya Angelou believed that courage was the most important virtue, because without it, we couldn't really, we wouldn't have the courage to really stand in the other virtues. And this is one example um, of how courage can turn a Pluto transit into something truly remarkable, valuable for the whole. Um, and it couldn't have been quite as powerful without the element of loss, right? So Pluto is associated with power, and loss is powerful. Loss is a powerful trigger in our lives. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but being realistic about the fact that it exists and having some acceptance about the fact that it exists, we can also um, maybe meditate on the fact that loss is so very powerful. And one of the greatest gifts of loss is illustrated in, there's a quote by Peter Kingsley. Now I heard it, and then I actually was not able to find it again. I heard it in a lecture by Mark Jones. And I'm going to paraphrase it since I can't find it again. And he says something like, everyone is afraid of loss, and yet it's only through loss that we are brought into direct contact with that which we can never lose. So we're reminded of that which we can never lose through the experience of loss. So it's that supreme essence that we can say no experience in life can take away from us. That we can call it soul, we can call it spirit, whatever animates the body, whatever animates us, that essence. And in the reincarnational view, it transcends even death. And that is the domain of Pluto very much. And Pluto has to do with destiny. It has to do with that essence. And so whatever area of life Saturn is touching right now, and in fact, all the planets come together for that essence in order to work for that essence of the soul. It's not just Pluto, but we're talking about Pluto here. But it's all the planets. Whatever area of life Saturn and Pluto are touching in your life right now, and it is some area of life for all of us, there is that opportunity, I venture to say, to connect with that which cannot be lost, to our spiritual essence, or whatever you like to call it. And my hope is that we can keep working through this aspect, which is already very much active, as we've seen, with less fear and greater openness, remaining steadfastly connected with that which cannot be lost. So my hope was to bring to you that that real reassurance that Pluto, Saturn, and really any aspect in the sky ultimately is helping us to move toward our true desires, our heart's desires, our soul's drives, and what we most want from this experience and in this experience here in the earth realm. So that's all for today. Please don't hesitate to comment if you have any questions or anything to add, or anything at all. And you can also find me with weekly astrology updates on Patreon at patreon.com/katya_coach, katya_coach. And you can find me at katya.coach as well. That's my website. And I think that's all. If you find me on Patreon and find it in your heart, and if it feels right for you to become a patron of my work, there are many gifts for that. Exclusive podcast episodes of my new podcast called Lift the Podcast, in which I interview luminaries in order to uplift, inspire, and mobilize humanity. And journals, gratitude journals created by myself, and the wonderfully talented artist Katya Garrison, and more readings, full readings with me and such. You can also find full readings with me and mini readings, as I mentioned earlier, on katya.coach. And I wish you peace and seeing of your inner being as you walk through this particularly potent transit.